Some wounds cut so deep they never heal, and Silas Granger carried more than his share. After losing his wife and his leg to cruel fate, the old mountain man had given up on hope, living alone on his remote ranch where silence was his only companion. Then one evening, a tiny horse appeared in his pasture. She was no bigger than a large dog, starving and abandoned, but her eyes held the same loneliness that filled his own heart. As Silas nursed the little creature back to health, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. The miniature horse became his family, his purpose, his reason to smile. But when a stranger arrived with legal papers claiming ownership, Silas faced an impossible choice. Would he lose the only thing that had brought joy back to his broken life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in every direction from Silas Granger's weathered porch, a landscape of rolling hills and stubborn pine that mirrored the man himself, scarred, solitary, but enduring. October of 1875 painted the aspens in brilliant gold, though Silas barely noticed such beauty anymore. His world had shrunk to the essentials: morning coffee, fence repairs, evening whiskey, and the crushing weight of memories that followed him like shadows. At 52, Silas moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose left leg ended just below the knee, replaced by a crude wooden prosthetic he'd carved himself during the long winter after Antietam. The limp had become part of his rhythm, like the steady tick of the mantel clock Sarah had loved so dearly. Everything in his life seemed measured by that same relentless cadence. Step, pause, step. A reminder that some things could never be fully restored. The ranch house itself bore witness to better days. Sarah's touch lingered in the yellow curtains she'd sewn, the herb garden now gone wild with mint and lavender, the rocking chair where she'd spent countless evenings mending his shirts while he read aloud from her favorite books. 3 winters had passed since the fever took her, but Silas hadn't moved a single item of hers. Her coffee cup still sat in the same spot on the kitchen table, her hairbrush remained on the bedroom dresser, and her recipe book lay open to the cornbread page she'd been consulting the morning she fell ill. In the top drawer of that same dresser, wrapped in a faded blue cloth, lay his Purple Heart medal. Silas never looked at it anymore, couldn't bear the weight of what it represented. The medal spoke of honor and sacrifice, but all he remembered was the screaming of horses and men, the smell of gunpowder and blood, and the moment a Confederate cannonball had shattered his leg and his faith in grand causes. He'd come home broken, and only Sarah's love had made him whole again. Now, with her gone, the medal felt like a mockery of everything he'd lost twice over. The war had taught him about loss, but Sarah had taught him about love. She'd found him in Denver, a bitter young veteran drinking away his pension and his pain. Somehow she'd seen past the anger and the limp to the man he could still become. Their courtship had been tentative, 2 wounded souls recognizing kinship in shared scars. She'd lost her parents to cholera, he'd lost his innocence to war, but together they'd built something beautiful on his grandfather's old homestead. Those had been golden years, filled with plans and dreams. They'd talked of children, of expanding the ranch, of growing old together, watching sunsets from this very porch. Sarah had a gift for making their simple life feel rich with possibility. She could turn a dinner of beans and cornbread into a feast with her stories and laughter, transform their humble cabin into a palace with her warmth and care. When the doctor told them children wouldn't come, Sarah had grieved quietly for a day, then announced they'd love each other twice as hard to make up for it. Doc Henderson still visited monthly, more from friendship than medical necessity. The old physician had delivered Sarah's final diagnosis with tears in his eyes, had sat with Silas through those terrible last nights when the fever raged and her breathing grew labored. Even now, Doc would arrive unannounced with a bottle of decent whiskey and medical news from town, checking Silas's leg and his spirits with equal concern. He never mentioned how Silas's hair had gone from salt and pepper to solid white almost, overnight after Sarah's death, or how the robust man he'd once known had withered into this gaunt shadow. Sheriff Matthews made his rounds too, though more for Silas's reputation than any legal necessity. The sheriff remembered the war hero who'd come home to build something good, the man whose word was his bond and whose rifle was always ready to help neighbors in need. In the old days, rustlers and claim jumpers had learned to avoid Grangerland, knowing the owner's military training made him a poor choice for easy targets. But that man had died with Sarah, leaving behind only this hollow shell who barely maintained his property and never ventured beyond its borders. The ranch itself encompassed nearly 800 acres of prime grazing land, bracketed by mountain streams and protected by natural ridges that made it nearly self-contained. Silas's grandfather had chosen well, claiming a spot where wildlife. Corridors funneled deer and elk through natural passes, where the soil was rich and the water never failed. In better days, the place had supported 100 head of cattle and a remuda of fine horses. Now, barely 30 cows wandered the overgrown pastures, and the corrals stood empty except for his old gelding, Buck, who seemed as tired of life as his master. Daily routines had become Silas's anchor against despair. He woke before dawn out of habit, lit the stove, and made coffee strong enough to float horseshoe nails. Breakfast was usually the same: bacon, eggs, and leftover biscuits eaten in silence while studying the endless horizon. Then came the slow inspection of his diminished domain, checking water troughs, counting cattle, mending whatever fence the elements had damaged during the night. The work barely filled half a day now, leaving long afternoons for darker contemplations. Evenings were the hardest. That's when Sarah's absence felt most acute, when the silence of the house pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He'd taken to talking aloud sometimes, addressing her chair or her photograph as if she might answer back. These one-sided conversations covered everything from weather observations to fragments of dreams where she appeared so vividly he'd wake expecting to find her beside him. The whiskey helped blur the edges of such painful clarity, though he was careful never to drink enough to dishonor her memory. That particular October evening had started like any other. Silas had spent the afternoon replacing boards on the back fence, the one that bordered his neighbor's abandoned homestead. The Petersons had given up the previous spring, loading their wagon with everything they owned and heading back to civilization after 3 years of drought and disappointment. Their departure had made Silas's isolation complete. No smoke from nearby chimneys, no distant sounds of children playing, no reason to maintain the social graces that Sarah had always insisted upon. The sun was settling behind the western peaks when Silas noticed the fence rail had split again, probably from the previous week's windstorm. He gathered his tools with the weary resignation of a man performing duties that no longer held meaning, wondering why he bothered maintaining boundaries around land that might as well have been on the moon for all the company it provided. As he approached the damaged section, hammer in hand and nails rattling in his shirt pocket, something made him stop mid-stride. There, standing in the tall grass of his back pasture, like a vision from a children's fairy tale, was the smallest horse he'd ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 30 inches tall at the withers, with a coat of silver grey, dappled with white patches, and a mane that hung to her tiny knees. She stood perfectly still, watching him with large dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a small creature. For a moment, Silas wondered if the whiskey had finally affected his mind, but the little horse moved then, taking a tentative step in his direction, and he realized this was no hallucination. She was real, solid, and clearly in distress. Her ribs showed through a coat that should have been fuller for the coming winter, and her legs trembled with the effort of standing. Yet there was something in her bearing, a dignity that reminded him of his finest cavalry horses, that kept her from appearing pitiful. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. The little horse's ears perked forward at the sound, and she took another careful step toward him. She wore no halter, bore no brand that he could see from this distance, and showed no fear of humans despite her obvious wild circumstances. Something about her eyes, intelligent, weary, but not defeated, struck a chord deep in Silas's chest that he'd thought had gone silent forever. He set down his hammer and extended one weathered hand, speaking softly, as he'd been taught to do with spooked cavalry mounts decades ago. "Easy now, little girl. Nobody's going to hurt you." The miniature horse considered his words, then walked directly to him with a trust that nearly broke his heart. When she reached his side, she leaned against his good leg with a sigh that seemed to carry all the loneliness in the world. Standing there in the fading light, with this impossible creature pressed against his side like a lost child seeking comfort, Silas Granger felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of indifference he'd built around his heart. For the first time in 3 years, something needed him, and God help him. He realized how desperately he needed to be needed. He looked down at the little horse, her dark eyes gazing up at him with complete trust, and made a decision that would change everything. "Come on then," he said quietly. "Let's get you fed and see what we're dealing with here." As he turned toward the barn, the tiny horse followed without hesitation, her small hooves making a soft percussion against the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the forgotten fence rail lay broken in the grass, but somehow it no longer seemed important. For the first time since Sarah's death, Silas Granger had something more pressing to occupy his evening than memories and regret. The barn felt different that night with the little horse inside. Silas had fashioned a makeshift stall from hay bales and old blankets, creating a space just the right size for his unexpected guest. She'd accepted his ministrations with remarkable grace, allowing him to check her hooves for stones and examine the minor cuts that spoke of a hard journey through rough country. When he offered her oats mixed with molasses, she ate delicately but thoroughly, her tiny muzzle soft against his palm as she cleaned up every grain. "Going to need a name for you," Silas murmured as he brushed her coat with gentle strokes. The grooming revealed her true colors beneath the trail dust, silver gray with white stockings and a star-shaped marking on her forehead that caught the lamplight like a blessing. "Can't keep calling you little horse forever." She turned her head to watch him work, those intelligent dark eyes tracking his every movement with an attention that felt almost human. By the 3rd day, she'd claimed not just the barn stall, but a piece of his heart he'd thought had died with Sarah. He found himself talking to her as he went about his chores, explaining his actions the way he used to do with Sarah when she'd follow him around the ranch in their early years together. "That's the water trough needs fixing," he'd tell the little horse as she grazed nearby. "Been meaning to replace those boards since spring, but somehow never got around to it." She'd lift her head and regard him solemnly, as if she understood perfectly why grief could make a man neglect such things. The name came to him on the 4th morning as he watched her pick her way carefully across the frost-covered pasture, moving with determination toward a patch of late-blooming wildflowers. There was something in her bearing, a refusal to be defeated, despite whatever hardships had brought her to his land, that reminded him of something Sarah used to say. "Hope springs eternal," she'd whisper during their darkest moments, when money was tight or the weather had been cruel to their crops. "As long as we're breathing, there's always hope for better days." "Hope," he said aloud, and the little horse turned toward him immediately, ears pricked forward as if she recognized her true name. "That's what you are, isn't it? Hope herself, come to visit an old fool who'd forgotten such things existed." From that moment forward, she was Hope, and she seemed to wear the name with pride. Hope proved to be unlike any horse he'd ever known. She followed him everywhere, not just around the ranch but into the house itself, her tiny hooves clicking delicately on the wood floors as she explored her new domain. She showed particular interest in Sarah's things, sniffing gently at the recipe book that lay open on the kitchen table, standing quietly beside the rocking chair as if she could sense the love that had once filled it. It was during one of these indoor explorations that Silas found himself reaching for Sarah's recipe book, something he hadn't touched since her death. Hope stood beside his chair as he turned the familiar pages, her warm breath stirring the edges of the yellowed paper. This was her favorite cornbread recipe, he told Hope, his voice catching slightly. Said her grandmother taught it to her back in Ohio before the family moved west. He could almost hear Sarah's laughter, see her flour-dusted hands, mixing ingredients with practiced ease. The little horse seemed to understand that these were sacred moments. She never interrupted when he spoke of Sarah, never grew restless during his longer stories about their life together. Instead, she'd settle beside his chair with the patience of a priest hearing confession, occasionally nuzzling his hand when the memories grew too heavy for words alone. Hope's presence began to work changes in him that he hadn't thought possible. For the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself looking forward to sunrise instead of dreading another empty day. There were small improvements at first. He started shaving regularly again, began preparing actual meals instead of surviving on coffee and whatever he could eat cold from a can. Hope seemed to approve of these changes, nickering softly when he emerged from the house, clean-shaven and properly dressed. The little horse displayed an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. When Silas struggled with his prosthetic leg on damp mornings, she'd position herself perfectly for him to lean against while he adjusted the straps. When his old war wounds ached and his mood darkened, she'd appear at his side with the timing of someone who'd studied his patterns for years instead of days. Most remarkably, she seemed to sense his emotional state with an accuracy that unnerved him, offering comfort exactly when he needed it most. Doc Henderson arrived for his monthly visit on a crisp morning when autumn was beginning its surrender to winter. Silas watched from the porch as the physician's buggy wound up the long drive, Hope grazing peacefully in the foreground like a scene from a children's picture book. The old doctor pulled up short when he spotted her, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile Silas had seen from him in months. "Well, I'll be damned." Doc Henderson climbed down from his buggy with the careful movements of a man past 70. "Where on earth did you find such a creature?" Hope approached the newcomer without fear, allowing him to scratch behind her ears while examining her with professional interest. "She's a miniature horse, Silas, bred special, not just a small pony. Someone put considerable time and money into creating this little lady." The observation sent an unexpected chill through Silas's chest. He'd assumed Hope was simply a foundling, perhaps escaped from some distant ranch or abandoned by travelers who couldn't afford to feed her. The possibility that she might belong to someone, that her appearance on his land might not be the gift from heaven he'd begun to believe, struck him like a physical blow. "You don't suppose someone's looking for her?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice casual, even as his hands clenched involuntarily. "I mean, if she's valuable and all, hard to say." Doc Henderson continued his examination, running experienced hands along Hope's tiny legs and checking her teeth with the thoroughness he'd once applied to Silas's own injuries. "She's well-bred, that's certain. Good bone structure, excellent temperament. But she's been on her own for a while now. I'd guess at least 2 weeks, maybe more. Her feet show hard travel, and she's lost considerable weight." He straightened with a grunt, fixing Silas with a knowing look. "Whoever owned her before, they let her down badly. She's yours now, as far as I'm concerned." The relief that flooded through Silas was so intense it left him momentarily lightheaded. He hadn't realized how much Hope had come to mean to him until faced with the possibility of losing her. The little horse seemed to sense his distress, moving to stand beside his good leg and leaning against him with that characteristic sigh that always made his heart skip. Doc Henderson noticed the interaction with professional interest. "She's attached to you too, I see. That's good, Silas, real good. You've been needing something to care for, something that needs you back." The old physician's eyes grew soft with memory. "Sarah always said you had too much love inside you to waste on grief alone. Looks like this little lady agrees." As they stood watching Hope explore the barnyard with the confidence of someone who'd claimed her territory, Doc Henderson shared what he knew about miniature horses. They were a relatively new breed in America, developed from European stock and prized for their intelligence, gentle temperament, and surprising strength. Some were trained as carriage horses for wealthy families, others kept as exotic pets or companions for children. All were expensive, which made Hope's appearance on Silas's remote ranch even more mysterious. "The thing is," Doc Henderson said as he prepared to leave, "creatures like this don't just wander off. Someone trained her, socialized her with humans. She's too trusting, too well-mannered to have been running wild for long." He paused at his buggy, one foot on the step. "Just be careful, Silas. If someone comes looking for her with papers and proof of ownership, you'll have legal obligations to consider." That evening, as Silas sat on his porch with Hope grazing nearby in the fading light, he found himself studying every line of her small body, memorizing the way she moved, the sound of her gentle breathing, the comfort of her presence. For the first time in 3 years, he was genuinely afraid of loss again, afraid of returning to the empty silence that had been his world before she arrived. "You're mine now," he whispered into the gathering darkness, and Hope lifted her head as if she'd heard him across the distance. "I don't care who owned you before or what papers they might have. You came to me when I needed you most, and that's got to count for something." The little horse nickered softly in response, then returned to her grazing, as if his declaration had settled some important matter between them. But even as he spoke the words, Silas felt a shadow of unease creeping across his newfound happiness. Doc Henderson's warning echoed in his mind, mingling with his own military experience of how quickly circumstances could change. He'd learned in the war that the things you loved most were often the first things you lost, and something deep in his soldier's instincts whispered that his time with Hope might be more fragile than he wanted to believe. The hand-carved wooden cross stood weathered, but proud on the hillside above the ranch, marking the spot where Sarah Granger rested, beneath Montana's endless sky. Silas had carved it himself during those first terrible weeks after her death, working by lamplight in the barn when sleep proved impossible. Every notch and curve had been shaped by grief and love in equal measure, the rough wood bearing witness to the tears he'd been too proud to shed in front of others. He'd never brought anyone to this sacred place, not even Doc Henderson, though the old physician had asked more than once if Silas wanted company for the climb. Sarah's grave was his alone to tend, his burden to bear, his last private connection to the woman who'd made his broken life whole again. But something about Hope's gentle presence made the solitude feel less necessary, less like protection and more like punishment. "Reckon it's time you met her properly," Silas told Hope as they began the gradual ascent through the aspens. The little horse picked her way carefully over the rocky path, showing none of the skittish behavior he might have expected from such a small creature navigating unfamiliar terrain. Instead, she seemed to sense the solemnity of their destination, her usual playful curiosity replaced by an almost reverent attention to his mood. The gravesite occupied a natural shelf of land where Sarah had loved to sit during their evening walks, a spot that offered views of the entire valley they'd called home. Silas had buried her facing east, toward the sunrise she'd greeted every morning of their marriage with the same sense of wonder she'd brought to everything in their shared life. Wildflowers had found the disturbed earth and made it beautiful again, Indian, paintbrush and lupine creating a living bouquet that Sarah would have appreciated more than any formal monument. Hope stopped a respectful distance from the grave, as if she understood this was hallowed ground. She lowered her head and stood perfectly still, her presence offering comfort without intrusion. Silas knelt beside the wooden cross with difficulty, his prosthetic leg making the movement awkward, but he needed to touch this piece of Sarah's world with his own hands. "Sarah, a darling," he began, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "I've brought someone to meet you. Her name's Hope, and she's been keeping me company these past weeks." He glanced over at the little horse, who remained motionless, ears forward, but not interrupting. "I think you'd like her. She's got your way of knowing what I need before I know it myself." The words came easier than they had in months, flowing like water released from a dam too long closed. He told Sarah about Hope's arrival, about the way she'd simply appeared when his world had grown too small for living. He spoke of mornings that no longer felt like punishments, and evenings that held possibility instead of just whiskey and regret. Most importantly, he tried to explain the guilt that gnawed at him, the fear that loving Hope somehow diminished the love he'd shared with his wife. "I'm not replacing you," he whispered, his hand resting on the worn wood of the cross. "Nobody could do that, and I wouldn't want them to. But I'm tired of being half dead, Sarah. Tired of living like my best days are behind me." Hope took a single step closer, just enough to let him know she was listening. And somehow, her presence made the conversation feel complete instead of one-sided. He shared memories he hadn't spoken aloud since Sarah's death. Their wedding day in the little Denver church. The first time she'd seen the ranch and declared it the most beautiful place on earth. The way she'd laughed at his clumsy attempts to learn her grandmother's cornbread recipe. Each recollection seemed to lighten the burden in his chest, as if Hope's quiet attention gave him permission to treasure these moments instead of hiding from them. "She's healing something in me I thought was broken forever," Silas admitted to the wooden cross, to Sarah's memory, to the wind that carried his words across the valley below. "I don't understand how or why, but I wake up each morning looking forward to the day, instead of just enduring it. That's got to be what you'd want for me, isn't it? To choose living over just surviving?" The sun was beginning its afternoon descent when Silas finally rose from beside the grave, his knees protesting the long period of stillness. Hope had waited patiently throughout the entire visit, never fidgeting or wandering away, maintaining her vigil with the loyalty of a longtime friend. As they prepared to leave, she approached the gravesite for the first time, lowering her head briefly toward the wooden cross before stepping back to Silas's side. During the walk back to the ranch house, Silas found his mind turning to practical matters for the first time in weeks. Hope would need proper shelter for the coming winter, something more substantial than the makeshift stall he'd created in the barn. The little horse would require specialized feed to maintain her weight through the cold months, and her unique size meant that standard horse equipment wouldn't serve her needs. These concerns felt different from the routine maintenance that had consumed his days since Sarah's death. Those tasks had been about preservation, about maintaining what already existed until time could claim it naturally. Planning for Hope's welfare was about creation, about building something new and better. The distinction marked a fundamental shift in how he approached each day, from managing decline to fostering growth. Back at the ranch house, Silas set about improving Hope's accommodations with the first genuine enthusiasm he'd felt for physical work in 3 years. He cleared out the old tack room, installing better ventilation and adding insulation against the winter cold. Hope supervised his efforts from the doorway, occasionally nickering what sounded like approval or gentle correction when he struggled with a particular measurement. The work progressed slowly but steadily, hampered by his prosthetic leg and the fact that many tools seemed designed for men with 2 functioning limbs. Yet the challenge felt invigorating rather than frustrating, each small success building toward a larger sense of purpose. Hope would have the finest accommodations he could provide, a space worthy of the gift she'd brought to his life. As evening approached and Silas cleaned his tools, Hope performed her usual inspection of the day's progress. She examined every corner of her new quarters with the thoroughness of a cavalry officer reviewing his troops, testing the strength of gate latches and investigating the texture of fresh bedding. When she finally settled into the thick straw with a contented sigh, Silas felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage. That night, as he sat on his porch, listening to the gentle sounds of Hope settling for sleep in her improved quarters, Silas found himself planning beyond tomorrow for the first time since Sarah's death. Winter preparations, spring projects, long-term improvements to the ranch, all focused on creating a life worthy of this small miracle that had wandered into his pasture. The wooden cross stood silhouetted against the stars on the hillside above. no longer a monument to endings, but a blessing on new beginnings. Sarah's memory would always be part of him, but it no longer defined the boundaries of what his life could become. Hope had shown him that healing didn't require forgetting, that love could expand rather than simply transfer from one object to another. For the first time in 3 years, Silas Granger fell asleep, planning for the future instead of mourning the past. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser, beneath Sarah's carefully folded quilts, lay a small leather pouch containing Confederate currency from the war. The bills were worthless now, had been worthless since Lee's surrender, but Silas kept them as a reminder of how quickly the solid ground beneath a man's feet could shift into quicksand. $20,000 in Confederate notes that wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. A sobering lesson about the fragility of everything humans considered permanent and valuable. He'd taken to showing Hope small treasures from his past, sharing pieces of his history the way some men shared favorite books or family photographs. The Confederate money fascinated her in the same way Sarah's recipe book had, though for different reasons. Where the cookbook held warmth and love, these bills represented loss and the arbitrary nature of fate. Yet holding them, while Hope stood nearby, somehow transformed their meaning from bitter to instructive. "Everything can change overnight," he told Hope as she sniffed delicately at the faded paper currency. "Thought these would set me up for life when I mustered out. Instead, they taught me that the only things worth keeping are the ones that can't be bought or sold." Hope seemed to consider this wisdom seriously, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond her species. The little horse had begun demonstrating abilities that bordered on supernatural. 3 mornings running, she'd awakened Silas by nickering urgently outside his bedroom window, leading him to discover problems that could have become catastrophic if left unattended. First, a section of fence that had come loose during the night, creating a gap large enough for cattle to wander onto the dangerous mountain trail. Then a water trough with a cracked base that would have drained completely by noon, leaving his small herd without access to fresh water. Most remarkably, Hope had somehow sensed an approaching weather change that caught even Silas's experienced eye unprepared. She'd grown restless and insistent, refusing to settle in her stall and repeatedly moving toward the barn's back entrance. When Silas finally followed her urgings, she led him directly to old Henderson's milk cow, who had wandered through the broken fence and was now stranded on a narrow ledge above Deadman's Creek. The rescue required careful maneuvering with ropes and patience, work that would have been impossible if the cow had fallen into the rushing water below. As Silas secured the frightened animal and guided her back to safety, he found himself wondering how Hope had known about a crisis occurring nearly half a mile from the ranch house. "Beyond any normal range of sight or hearing, you're something special, aren't you, girl?" he murmured as they walked the rescued cow back to her proper pasture. Hope trotted alongside with unmistakable pride, as if she understood her role in preventing disaster. Makes a man wonder if angels come in different forms than we expect. The transformation in Silas became apparent to everyone who knew him. Doc Henderson arrived for his monthly visit to find the ranch looking better than it had since Sarah's death. Fences stood straight and strong, water troughs gleamed with fresh repair, and the house itself showed signs of renewed attention. Most telling of all, Silas met him at the gate, clean-shaven, properly dressed, and genuinely pleased to see company. "You're looking better, my friend," Doc Henderson observed, as Hope performed her customary greeting, allowing him to scratch behind her ears while examining her with professional interest. "Putting on weight, sleeping better from the look of your eyes. This little lady's been good medicine for what ailed you." They sat on the porch, sharing coffee and conversation, while Hope grazed nearby, her presence adding warmth to what had once been awkward social visits. Silas found himself talking more freely than he had in years, sharing plans for winter preparations and spring improvements with enthusiasm that surprised them both. The doctor listened with evident satisfaction, occasionally glancing at Hope as if silently thanking her for accomplishing what months of medical advice had failed to achieve. "I've been thinking about expanding the operation come spring," Silas admitted, voicing plans he'd barely acknowledged to himself. "Maybe adding some sheep, improving the breeding stock. This ranch could support more than it has been, if a man put proper effort into it." The words felt strange in his mouth after 3 years of merely maintaining what already existed, but they also felt right in a way that nothing had since Sarah's death. Doc Henderson nodded approvingly. "Sarah always said this place had more potential than you were using. She'd be pleased to see you thinking like a rancher again instead of just a caretaker." The mention of Sarah's name no longer sent spikes of pain through Silas's chest. Instead, it brought warmth, as if her approval was something he could still earn and treasure. Hope had begun displaying an almost protective attitude towards Silas, positioning herself between him and potential dangers with the instincts of a trained guard animal. When his prosthetic leg gave him particular trouble on damp mornings, she seemed to sense his difficulty and would appear at his side, offering her small but steady bulk as a living crutch. During his moments of darkest memory, when grief still occasionally ambushed him without warning, she would simply stand close enough for him to feel her warmth, never demanding attention but always available for comfort. The little horse showed particular sensitivity to his war-damaged leg, somehow understanding that certain movements cause pain and adjusting her behavior accordingly. She never crowded his left side, where the prosthetic made balance precarious, never moved suddenly when he was using her for support, never displayed the impatience that even well-trained horses sometimes showed when asked to accommodate human limitations. Most remarkably, Hope seemed to understand the rhythm of his emotional cycles, the way grief could strike without warning, even in the midst of healing. During these episodes, she would abandon whatever activity had occupied her attention and simply remain near, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of memory and loss. She never intruded on his private moments, but never left him entirely alone either, maintaining a watch that felt protective without being suffocating. The local community began taking notice of the changes at the Granger ranch. Sheriff Matthews stopped by unannounced one afternoon and spent an hour admiring Hope while discussing local news with obvious pleasure. The sheriff's wife had sent along fresh bread and preserves, the first neighborly gesture Silas had received since the funeral meals that followed Sarah's death. "Word's getting around about your little friend here," Sheriff Matthews said, as Hope demonstrated her unusual intelligence by responding to simple spoken commands. "Folks are curious about where she came from, how you came to have her. Some are saying she's the prettiest horse they've ever seen, size notwithstanding." The comment stirred uneasiness in Silas's chest, though he tried to dismiss it as unnecessary worry. Hope had been with him for weeks now, without any sign of previous owners or legal claims. Surely, if someone had been looking for such a distinctive animal, word would have reached the sheriff's office by now. Yet something in the lawman's tone suggested more than casual community interest, anyone in particular asking questions. Silas kept his voice casual, but Hope seemed to sense his tension and moved closer to his side. "Nothing specific," Sheriff Matthews replied, though his eyes carried the careful expression of a man choosing his words deliberately. "Just the usual curiosity about anything unusual in these parts. You know how folks talk." But as he prepared to leave, the sheriff's parting words carried an undertone of warning. "Just remember, Silas, if anyone ever comes around with legal papers and proof of ownership, the law's got to be followed regardless of personal feelings." That evening, as Silas sat on his porch, watching Hope graze in the fading light, the sheriff's words echoed in his mind, like distant thunder promising storms to come. Sarah's locket had never left the top drawer of the bedroom dresser, nestled in its bed of faded silk beside her other treasures. The delicate gold chain had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd understood that some keepsakes held more value than their material worth. Inside the oval frame, a tiny daguerreotype showed Sarah at 20, her eyes bright with the dreams that would eventually lead her to a broken soldier in a Denver saloon. Silas had avoided opening the locket since her death, unable to bear the intimate glimpse of the woman she'd been before grief and loss had marked them both. But Hope's gentle presence somehow made the memories feel less like wounds and more like gifts worth sharing. On a quiet November morning, with snow threatening in the pewter-colored clouds, he finally brought the locket to the kitchen table, where Hope stood watching his daily routines. This was her most precious possession, he told Hope as his weathered fingers worked the tiny clasp. Said it held her family's luck, all the love that came before us and would come after. The mechanism released with a soft click, revealing not just the photograph, but a curl of golden hair, still bright after all these years. Hope moved closer, her warm breath stirring the air as she examined this new treasure with respectful attention. The photograph showed Sarah before life had taught her about loss, when her smile held nothing back and her eyes promised adventures still to come. Seeing her face in this unguarded moment brought Silas not the crushing pain he'd expected, but a warmth that spread through his chest like good whiskey on a cold night. Hope seemed to sense the shift in his mood, nickering softly as if approving of this sharing of sacred things. "She would have loved you," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion that no longer felt destructive. "Had a way with animals that was pure magic. Could gentle the most skittish horse with just her voice and patience." He found himself telling Hope stories he'd never shared with another soul. How Sarah had nursed orphaned foals. How she'd spent weeks earning the trust of a wild mustang that had wandered onto their land. How her touch seemed to heal creatures that others had given up for lost. The approaching winter brought its own challenges and revelations. A fierce storm struck in mid-November, the kind of sudden mountain blizzard that could trap travelers for days and test the preparation of even experienced ranchers. Silas had battened down for the duration, securing livestock and stockpiling supplies with the methodical precision that had kept him alive during the war's worst campaigns. But Hope seemed to sense danger beyond the obvious threat of wind and snow. As the storm built to its peak, she grew increasingly agitated, pacing her stall and calling out with urgent whinnies that cut through the howling wind. At first, Silas attributed her behavior to natural fear of the violent weather. Then her cries took on a desperate quality that pierced through his assumption and demanded investigation. Fighting his way through waist-deep snow and driving wind, Silas followed Hope's urgent guidance toward the back section of his property, where the land dropped away into a steep ravine. What he found there nearly stopped his heart. A massive pine, undermined by the storm's fury, had begun to slide down the unstable slope directly toward his house. Without Hope's warning, he would have slept through the disaster, until tons of timber and stone crashed through his roof, working with ropes and levers in conditions that tested every survival skill he'd learned in 30 years of mountain living. Silas managed to redirect the falling tree away from his home and into the empty ravine below. The work left him exhausted and shaking, his prosthetic leg nearly useless in the deep snow, but alive and grateful in ways that went beyond simple relief. Hope had saved not just his life, but everything he'd built with Sarah. Every memory contained within those walls. As he stumbled back to the warmth of his house, the little horse pressed close to his side, her small body radiating heat and comfort through his snow-soaked clothes. The storm had tested them both, and they'd survived together. The incident marked a turning point in Silas's understanding of his relationship with Hope. She wasn't simply a companion animal that had wandered into his life by chance. She was something far more significant, a creature whose presence seemed to carry protective power that defied rational explanation. The realization brought both wonder and worry, a growing awareness that losing her would mean more than just returning to solitude. Doc Henderson's next visit confirmed what Silas had begun to suspect about Hope's exceptional nature. The old physician examined her with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent 50 years treating both animals and humans, his experienced hands checking everything from her teeth to her hooves while she submitted with unusual patience. Never seen anything quite like her. Doc Henderson admitted as they stood in the barn, watching Hope demonstrate her uncanny ability to respond to subtle verbal commands. Intelligence like this is rare in any animal, but combined with her breeding and temperament, well, someone invested considerable time and money in creating her. The words carried an undertone that made Silas's stomach tighten with familiar dread. You think someone's still looking for her? The question came out more sharply than Silas intended, betraying the fear that had begun haunting his improved sleep. Doc Henderson's hesitation lasted just long enough to confirm Silas's worst suspicions. Hard to say for certain, but animals like this don't just disappear without someone taking notice. If she was stolen or lost during transport, he left the sentence unfinished. But its implications hung in the cold barn air like smoke. The conversation shifted to practical matters, but Silas found his attention drifting to Hope as she explored her domain with the confidence of someone who belonged. The little horse had claimed not just his barn and pastures, but his heart, filling spaces he'd thought would remain empty forever. The possibility of losing her felt like standing at the edge of another grave, another wound that might never heal. That evening, Silas sat in Sarah's old rocking chair with Hope standing nearby, her presence a comfort against thoughts too dark for winter nights. He opened the locket again, studying Sarah's young face by lamplight, while Hope watched with the patience of someone who understood the importance of memory and connection. I can't lose her too, he whispered to the photograph, to Sarah's memory, to the empty spaces that Hope had begun to fill. I know it's selfish, but I need her more than I've needed anything since you died. The admission carried the weight of prayer and confession combined, a recognition that his healing had become inseparable from this small miracle that had wandered into his pasture. Outside, the wind carried hints of more snow to come, but inside the warmth of his home, surrounded by Sarah's memory and Hope's presence, Silas allowed himself to believe that some gifts were meant to be permanent. The military field manual lay open on Silas's kitchen table, its familiar pages yellowed with age but still readable in the lamplight. He hadn't consulted the tactical guide since the war's end, but circumstances had awakened instincts he'd thought buried with his uniform. The manual's section on defensive positioning and reconnaissance felt relevant again, though the enemy this time wore civilian clothes and carried legal documents instead of rifles. Hope stood nearby as he studied diagrams of sight lines and escape routes, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand that their peaceful routine was under threat. The little horse had grown attuned to his moods with uncanny precision, and his current state of watchful preparation clearly disturbed her usual calm. She moved closer to his chair, offering the comfort of her warm presence while he planned for possibilities he hoped would never materialize. Might need to teach you some new tricks. A girl, Silas murmured, turning to a chapter on concealment and evasion. Ways to hide if strangers come calling with papers and bad intentions. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. But experience had taught him that hoping for the best while preparing for the worst was the only way sensible men approached uncertain futures. His first strategic decision involved liquidating assets to raise cash for potential legal expenses. The dozen head of prime cattle he'd been saving for spring breeding brought good money from Henderson's cousin, who asked no awkward questions about the sudden sale. Sheriff Matthews helped arrange the transaction quietly, his manner suggesting he understood more about Silas's situation than their conversations had explicitly covered. Sometimes a man's got to choose his battles carefully, the sheriff observed as they watched the cattle being loaded for transport. Legal system's got its own rules, and they don't always favor justice over paperwork. His words carried the weight of experience with cases where technical ownership trumped moral rightness, leaving honest folks to suffer for the sake of legal precision. The money, nearly $300, represented security and options. But it also marked the first time since Sarah's death that Silas had made major decisions based on fear rather than simple maintenance of routine. Hope seemed to sense this shift. growing more protective in her behavior and showing unusual alertness to sounds beyond their normal range of hearing. Doc Henderson's next revelation came during what should have been a routine social visit. The old physician arrived with news that drained the color from Silas's face and sent Hope pressing close to his side as if she could shield him from unwelcome truths through proximity. Alone. "There's been a man asking questions in town," Doc Henderson said without preamble, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by worried directness. "Goes by the name of Ezra Blackwood, claims he's tracking stolen property through the territory. Sheriff Matthews has been deflecting his inquiries, but the man's persistent, and he's got papers that look official." The name meant nothing to Silas, but something about its sound, sharp consonants that suggested hardness of character, made his war-trained instincts prickle with warning. Men who hunted other men's treasures rarely possessed gentle natures, and those who did it with legal backing often proved worse than common thieves. "What kind of papers?" Silas kept his voice steady, but Hope moved even closer, her small body trembling with tension that matched his own. "Claims to have bills of sale, breeding records, transportation documents. Says a valuable miniature mare was stolen during shipment from Colorado to California. Describes an animal that matches Hope's appearance exactly." Doc Henderson's medical training made him precise with details, but his fondness for Hope colored his delivery with obvious reluctance. The information hit Silas like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears while raising new questions about Hope's origins. If she truly had been stolen during legitimate transport, his moral position became infinitely more complicated. Keeping her might make him an accomplice to theft, regardless of how desperately he needed her presence in his healing life. But something about the story felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Hope's behavior around strangers was trusting to the point of naivety, suggesting she'd never experienced harsh treatment or cause for fear. Her excellent health and gentle temperament indicated careful breeding and handling by people who valued her well-being. Why would thieves steal such an animal only to abandon her in remote mountain country where she might starve? "This Blackwood fellow," Silas said carefully, "what's your impression of his character?" Doc Henderson's expression darkened with disapproval. "Hard man. The kind who measures everything by its cash value and treats animals like machinery. Got a reputation around Denver for sharp dealing and harsh methods with livestock." He paused, studying Hope with evident affection. "Can't imagine him raising anything as gentle and trusting as our little friend here." That evening, Silas began implementing defensive measures drawn from his military experience. He taught Hope to respond to hand signals that would send her to hiding places among the rocks and timber where mounted searchers couldn't follow. The little horse learned these lessons with disturbing quickness, as if she understood that her safety might depend on invisibility and silence. He practiced the signals repeatedly until Hope could vanish into prepared concealment at a simple gesture, her small size and intelligence making her nearly impossible to track through the rocky terrain above his ranch. The training sessions left them both exhausted, but better prepared for whatever confrontation might come. Sleep became elusive as Silas found himself starting awake at every unusual sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he'd moved beside his bed. Hope seemed to share his restless vigilance, often standing at his bedroom window during the dark hours when threats felt most imminent. Her presence provided comfort, but it also reminded him constantly of how much he had to lose. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, not the war dreams that had plagued him for years, but new terrors, where faceless men with legal documents dragged Hope away while he stood helpless to intervene. He would wake with his heart pounding and sweat cooling on his skin, immediately checking to ensure Hope was safely in her stall and not vanished like some cruel dream within a dream. Community support began, materializing in subtle ways that warmed Silas's heart, even as they highlighted his growing isolation from normal life. Sheriff Matthews started making more frequent patrols past the ranch, always with plausible official reasons, but clearly maintaining protective surveillance. Doc Henderson brought extra supplies during his visits, stockpiling medical necessities against uncertain futures. Most significantly, word had somehow spread through the local network of ranchers and townspeople that Silas Granger might need assistance defending something precious. Neighbors who'd respected his grief-driven solitude now made their loyalty quietly known, offering help with the careful indirectness that characterized mountain folk who understood the value of asking no unnecessary questions. But as winter deepened and the threats grew more concrete, Silas realized that community support might not be enough against legal machinery backed by official documentation. The war had taught him that good intentions rarely triumphed over superior firepower, and in civilian life, proper paperwork served the same function as overwhelming force. The hidden birth certificate changed everything. Tucked beneath Hope's makeshift halter, a simple rope affair Silas had fashioned during her first week at the ranch, lay a water-stained document that revealed truths more devastating than any he'd imagined. The paper had been sewn into the leather lining with careful stitches, hidden so well that weeks of grooming and care had never revealed its presence until Hope's halter finally needed replacement. Silas discovered it while crafting a proper leather halter to replace the temporary rope, his fingers finding the unusual thickness in what should have been smooth material. The document came free with gentle pressure, its official seals and careful handwriting immediately distinguishing it from any ordinary paperwork. As he read the faded text by lamplight, with Hope standing quietly nearby, the world he'd rebuilt around her presence crumbled into moral complexity. Certificate of birth and registration, the heading proclaimed in formal script. Miniature horse registry of Colorado. The details that followed painted a picture that broke Silas's heart, even as they explained Hope's extraordinary nature. She'd been bred specifically for therapeutic work, her bloodlines carefully selected for intelligence, gentle temperament, and the unusual empathy that made certain animals perfect companions for healing human trauma. Most damning of all, the certificate listed her destination: St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Denver, where young patients suffering from injuries and illnesses would benefit from her specially trained presence. Hope hadn't been some wealthy family's exotic pet or a breeder's investment. She'd been destined to bring comfort to sick children who needed her even more desperately than Silas did. The moral implications hit him like a physical blow. Every moment of joy Hope had brought him, every step toward healing she'd facilitated, had been stolen from children whose need might be greater than his own. The little horse who'd saved his life and restored his purpose had been meant for others whose survival might literally depend on the therapy she could provide. Hope seemed to sense his distress, moving closer to press her warm side against his leg, while he struggled with revelations that reframed everything about their relationship. She nickered softly, the sound carrying the same gentle comfort she'd offered during his darkest moments, unaware that her very presence now represented a choice between his healing and his honor. Ezra Blackwood's arrival the next morning felt like divine punishment for moral cowardice Silas hadn't yet committed but desperately wanted to. The man rode up the ranch drive with two companions, all mounted on horses that spoke of money and careful breeding. Blackwood himself was exactly what Doc Henderson had described: hard-featured, cold-eyed, and possessed of the casual arrogance that came from believing legal documents trumped human feeling. "You'd be Silas Granger," Blackwood announced without dismounting, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "I'm here about stolen property you've been harboring on your land." He produced a leather portfolio with theatrical precision, extracting documents that rustled importantly in the morning air. "A miniature mare named Charity, stolen during transport 3 months ago. I have bills of sale, breeding records, and transportation contracts that prove ownership." The name struck Silas like a revelation. Charity, not Hope. Even her identity had been his creation. Another layer of self-deception that made his attachment feel both precious and false. He studied Blackwood's companions with the tactical awareness that war had burned into his instincts, noting their positions, the weapons they carried, the calculating way they evaluated his property and defenses. "I found a horse on my land," Silas replied carefully, his prosthetic leg suddenly feeling heavier as stress awakened old pains. "Starving and abandoned. Been caring for her according to territorial law regarding strays." The words felt inadequate against the weight of official documentation, but they represented his only legal defense against superior paperwork. Blackwood's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who'd anticipated every possible objection. Territorial law requires reasonable effort to locate owners before claiming abandoned property. You made no such efforts according to Sheriff Matthews' records. That makes you complicit in theft, subject to both criminal charges and civil damages. The threat was delivered with the casual precision of someone who'd used legal intimidation many times before. Silas felt the familiar chill of being outgunned and outmaneuvered, the same helpless fury that had characterized his worst moments during the war. But underneath the fear ran a current of suspicion that Blackwood's story contained flaws too convenient to be accidental. "Funny thing," Silas said slowly, his mind working through inconsistencies that his emotional turmoil had initially obscured. "Horse shows up healthy and well-trained, but you claim she was stolen 3 months ago. Takes more than good fortune to maintain condition like that in the wild." Hope had appeared thin, but not emaciated. Her coat dull but not diseased, her temperament trusting rather than traumatized. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with the wariness of someone whose fabrications had been challenged by unexpected intelligence. Thieves might have kept her in decent shape, planning to sell her later. Point is, she's mine by legal right, and I'm prepared to involve federal marshals if necessary to recover my property. But something in his manner, the way his eyes avoided Hope when she emerged from the barn, the careful distance he maintained from an animal he claimed to own, triggered every alarm Silas's military experience had taught him to recognize. Men who truly cared for valuable animals didn't speak of them as mere property, didn't approach them with obvious distaste, didn't fail to show recognition when reunited with supposedly beloved creatures. "Tell you what," Silas said, inspiration born from desperation giving him sudden clarity. "If she's really yours, call her by name. Use whatever commands she was trained to follow. Shouldn't be any problem for a man who owns such a valuable animal." The challenge hung in the air between them, backed by logic that even legal documents couldn't easily dismiss. Blackwood's hesitation lasted just long enough to confirm Silas's growing suspicions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the forced confidence of someone improvising badly. "Animals been traumatized by her experience, might not respond immediately to familiar commands. That's why I brought documentation instead of relying on uncertain recognition." The explanation felt false in every particular, confirmed by Hope's behavior as she studied the 3 strangers with the wariness she'd never shown toward Doc Henderson or Sheriff Matthews. Her ears lay back slightly, her posture suggesting discomfort that bordered on fear, reactions completely contrary to how she should greet a beloved former owner. Most telling of all, Blackwood made no effort to approach Hope directly, showed no sign of the affection or concern that characterized genuine ownership of prized animals. His companions remained mounted and alert, positioned more like hired muscle than legitimate assistants in recovering stolen property. "Here's what I think happened," Silas said, pieces of the truth assembling themselves with the clarity that came from military experience, with deception and misdirection. "You're the one who stole her, probably during legitimate transport to that children's hospital in Denver. Been looking for a buyer ever since, but her special training makes her too recognizable for normal markets. Now you need to establish legal ownership before you can sell her safely." Blackwood's face hardened with the ugly expression of someone whose criminal plans had been exposed by unwelcome intelligence. "You've got no proof of such accusations, old man." Just the word of a broken-down soldier against legitimate business documents. Who do you think any court's going to believe? The threat carried real weight, backed by legal machinery that rarely favored ordinary citizens against men with money and official papers. But it also revealed the fundamental weakness in Blackwood's position. He needed cooperation or legal victory to claim hope, and Silas's growing understanding of the truth gave him weapons to fight back with. Hope moved to stand beside Silas, her small body trembling with tension, but her loyalty unmistakable. Whatever her origins or true name, whatever legal claims might exist against her presence, she'd chosen her side in the conflict with the clear judgment that had guided all her actions since arriving at the ranch. "Get off my land," Silas said quietly, his hand moving to rest on Hope's neck in a gesture that claimed protection as much as ownership. "Come back with federal marshals if you want, but don't expect me to just hand over what you stole from sick children for your own profit." The confrontation hung balanced on the edge of violence. 3 armed men against 1 aging veteran and a miniature horse whose true value had become heartbreakingly clear. Sarah's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its worn leather binding cracked, but still intact after decades of faithful use. The thin pages rustled like autumn leaves as Silas turned to passages that had sustained his wife through their hardest moments together. Pressed between the familiar verses were flowers she'd gathered during their courtship, violets from their first picnic, a rose from their wedding bouquet, prairie grass from the day they'd first seen the ranch together. "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself," Silas read aloud, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Hope stood nearby, her presence a comfort, even as he grappled with decisions that would determine both their futures. The biblical words carried weight beyond their religious meaning, speaking to the choice between selfish desire and sacrificial love that defined moral character in its purest form. He'd spent the sleepless night after Blackwood's departure, wrestling with revelations that had transformed Hope from miracle to moral test. The hidden birth certificate lay beside the Bible, its official seals mocking every justification he might construct for keeping what wasn't truly his to claim. Yet surrender felt like a second death, another amputation of something essential to his continued existence. The telegram to St. Mary's Children's Hospital had required 3 drafts before Silas found words that balanced truth with hope. "Have miniature mare matching description stolen property. Believe in unlawful hands. Need verification before action." The message would travel the telegraph wires to Denver, carrying questions that would determine whether his moral crisis served any useful purpose beyond personal torment. Doc Henderson arrived at noon with Sheriff Matthews in tow, both men wearing the grim expressions of people bearing unwelcome news. They found Silas on his porch, with Hope grazing nearby, the peaceful domestic scene belying the tension that had kept him awake through another long night of impossible choices. "Got an answer to your telegram?" Sheriff Matthews said without preamble, producing a yellow paper that rustled with the authority of official communication. "Hospital confirms the theft, describes the animal exactly, says 23 sick children have been waiting 3 months for her arrival." Each detail landed like a physical blow, confirming Silas's worst fears while making his moral obligations inescapably clear. The sheriff's voice softened as he continued reading. Says the mare was specifically trained for pediatric therapy, bred for gentleness and intelligence that makes her irreplaceable for their program. Children with severe injuries and terminal illnesses who respond to animal therapy when human contact becomes too painful to bear. Hope lifted her head as if sensing the gravity of their conversation, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to understand she was the subject of their weighty discussion. The trust in her gaze made Silas's throat tighten with emotions too complex for simple description. Love mixed with loss, pride battling with sacrifice, the terrible arithmetic of measuring his healing against the needs of dying children. "There's more," Doc Henderson added gently, his medical training making him sensitive to the pain his words would cause. Hospital says they're desperate. Had to turn away potential patients because they can't provide the therapy these children need without her. Some of those kids are running out of time. The information settled over Silas like lead blankets, crushing his last hopes for moral flexibility in a situation that demanded absolute clarity. Hope wasn't just missed by the children. Her absence was literally costing lives, denying comfort to the dying and healing to those who might still recover with proper care. "I know what I have to do," Silas said quietly, his hand moving to rest on Hope's neck as she approached his chair. "Known it since I found that certificate. Just been fighting the inevitable because I'm too old and too broken to lose another piece of my heart." The admission cost him everything, but it also brought the strange peace that came from accepting necessary sacrifice. Sheriff Matthews studied him with the respect due a man making honorable choices under impossible circumstances. "Blackwood's been pressuring me for action, threatening to bring federal marshals if I don't seize the horse immediately. Claims he's got legal standing to demand immediate return of stolen property. But we know he's the thief," Silas protested, his military instincts rebelling against surrender to criminal deception. "Turning Hope over to him just makes us accomplices in his crime. Knowing and proving are different things in a court of law," the sheriff replied with the weariness of someone who'd seen justice fail too many times. "His paperwork looks legitimate, and he's got the advantage of being the complainant. Without witnesses to the original theft or evidence linking him to the crime, we're operating on suspicion rather than proof." Doc Henderson leaned forward in his chair, his expression carrying the intensity that marked important medical decisions. "There might be another way, Silas. What if we bypass Blackwood entirely and return Hope directly to the hospital? Make her disappearance look like escape rather than deliberate transfer." The suggestion sparked hope in Silas's chest, a possibility he hadn't considered that might serve justice while fulfilling moral obligations. If Hope could reach Denver safely, her true owners could deal with Blackwood's fraudulent claims through proper legal channels, while the children received their desperately needed therapy. "Dangerous proposition," Sheriff Matthews observed, his lawman's training making him cautious about strategies that skirted legal technicalities. "Blackwood's watching this place, probably has men positioned to intercept any attempt to move the horse. Getting her to Denver without confrontation would require careful planning and considerable luck." They spent the afternoon developing a strategy that drew heavily on Silas's military experience with tactical movement and concealment. The direct route to Denver was impossible, too exposed, too easily monitored by Blackwood's watchers. But alternative paths existed through mountain passes that required local knowledge and physical endurance beyond what most criminals would attempt. Doc Henderson volunteered to accompany them, his medical skills potentially crucial for both Hope's welfare and Silas's prosthetic leg during a difficult journey. The old physician had made such trips before, carrying medical supplies to remote mining camps, and his knowledge of mountain trails could prove invaluable for avoiding Blackwood's surveillance. "We'll need to leave tonight," Silas decided, studying maps that showed routes through territory he'd hunted and trapped in his younger days. "Travel under cover of darkness, stay off the main roads, move fast enough to reach Denver before Blackwood realizes we're gone." The plan required physical demands that his damaged leg might not tolerate. But the alternative, surrendering Hope to a criminal, was unacceptable. Hope seemed to sense the preparation for travel, following Silas closely as he gathered supplies and checked equipment. Her behavior carried an alertness that suggested understanding, as if she knew their peaceful routine was ending and uncertain times lay ahead. When he knelt to fit her with the new leather halter, she stood perfectly still, accepting the change with the trust that had characterized all her interactions with him. The evening meal felt like a last supper, shared in the kitchen where so many of their quiet conversations had taken place. Silas found himself memorizing details, the way Hope's ears pricked forward when he spoke her name, the soft sound of her breathing, the warmth of her presence that had filled the empty spaces in his damaged life. "You understand what we're doing, don't you, girl?" he asked as he brushed her coat one final time before their departure. "Taking you back where you belong, to children who need you more than I do." Hope turned her head to watch him work, her expression carrying what looked remarkably like gratitude for his choice to sacrifice personal happiness for greater good. As darkness settled over the ranch, Silas made his final preparations with the methodical precision that had kept him alive during the war's worst campaigns. He packed light but comprehensively, including medical supplies for Hope and emergency provisions for unexpected delays. Most importantly, he wrote letters to the hospital explaining Hope's condition and care requirements, to Sheriff Matthews detailing Blackwood's criminal behavior, to Sarah's memory explaining why this sacrifice honored rather than betrayed the love they'd shared. The moon was dark when they began their journey. 3 travelers moving silently through mountain passes that had sheltered fugitive slaves, desperate miners, and others whose survival depended on avoiding unwanted attention. Hope traveled in a specially designed cart that protected her from the worst terrain while allowing rapid movement through narrow trails. Behind them, Silas's ranch house stood empty but not abandoned. Sheriff Matthews would maintain surveillance until their return, protecting the property that represented everything Silas and Sarah had built together. Ahead lay Denver and the fulfillment of moral obligations that would cost him the companion who'd restored meaning to his life. As they climbed higher into the mountains, with Hope traveling trustfully beside him and Doc Henderson's steady presence offering reassurance, Silas felt the complex mixture of grief and pride that came from choosing duty over desire. Sarah would have understood, would have supported this decision that honored the values they'd shared during their too brief time together. The journey to Denver would test everything he'd learned about survival, sacrifice, and the difference between mere existence and truly meaningful life. The cavalry saber felt strange against Silas's hip after so many years of peaceful retirement. The curved blade had served him through 3 campaigns, its steel bearing nicks from Confederate sabers and bullet scars from rebel pistols. He'd sworn never to wear it again after Appomattox, but protecting Hope required every advantage his military experience could provide. The familiar weight reminded his body of skills that age and injury hadn't entirely erased. Devil's Canyon offered the only practical route to Denver that avoided the main roads where Blackwood's men would be watching. The narrow pass cut through granite walls that rose 200 feet on either side, creating shadows deep enough to hide their passage even under the weak starlight. Doc Henderson's horse picked its way carefully over loose stone, the specially designed cart carrying Hope rolling smoothly on wheels Silas had modified for silent operation. Hope traveled with remarkable calm, her trust in Silas's judgment allowing her to rest despite the unfamiliar motion and strange surroundings. Occasionally, she would lift her head to study their route, her intelligent eyes reflecting starlight as she assessed their progress with what seemed like understanding of their mission's importance. "How much further to the Denver Trail?" Doc Henderson whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft sounds of hooves on stone and wheels turning over careful ground. The old physician had proven surprisingly hardy for the dangerous journey, his lifetime of medical calls in difficult terrain serving him well during their nighttime travel. 2 hours, maybe less, Silas replied, consulting landmarks visible in the darkness. "Once we clear the canyon, we'll have open ground and better time until sunrise." The plan called for reaching the main road before dawn, when Blackwood's watchers would be least alert and their chances of detection minimal. The ambush came without warning, gunfire erupting from positions Blackwood's men had obviously prepared well in advance. Muzzle flashes lit the canyon walls like deadly fireworks, while bullets ricocheted off stone with sparks and screaming metal. Silas's war-trained instincts took control before conscious thought could interfere, his body responding to combat with reflexes that decades couldn't entirely suppress. "Get Hope to cover," he shouted to Doc Henderson, while drawing his Colt revolver with movements that felt like muscle memory returning after long sleep. The cart's position made it vulnerable to crossfire, but a sheltered alcove 20 yards ahead offered protection if they could reach it without exposing Hope to direct gunfire. 3 riders emerged from concealment with the coordination of men who'd planned this ambush carefully. Blackwood himself led the charge, his face twisted with the ugly satisfaction of someone whose trap had worked perfectly. His companions flanked wide, trying to prevent escape while maintaining killing fields that would make resistance suicidal for ordinary travelers. But Silas Granger was no ordinary traveler. War had taught him that survival often depended on aggressive response to overwhelming odds, that defensive thinking got good men killed, while boldness might create opportunities where none seemed to exist. His first shot took down Blackwood's horse, sending the man tumbling into rocky ground, while his mount screamed and thrashed in pain. "You old fool." Blackwood snarled as he rolled behind boulder cover, his expensive clothes torn and bloody from his fall. "All this trouble for one damn horse. Should have taken my offer and saved yourself a bullet." His words carried the rage of someone whose careful plans had met unexpected resistance from a source he'd underestimated completely. Doc Henderson moved the cart with surprising skill, using terrain features to shield Hope, while Silas provided covering fire against the 2 mounted attackers. The little horse remained calm despite the chaos around her, her trust in her protectors absolute, even as bullets whined overhead and gunpowder smoke filled the narrow canyon. Silas's military training served him well in the tactical situation, his experience with cavalry actions allowing him to predict how mounted opponents would maneuver in restricted terrain. When the second rider tried to flank their position, Silas was ready with careful aim that sent the man tumbling from his saddle with a wounded shoulder and a healthy respect for veteran marksmanship. The fight settled into a deadly game of patience and positioning, each side seeking advantage while avoiding exposure to enemy fire. Hope's cart had reached the protective alcove, but escape required eliminating the threat that Blackwood and his remaining companion represented. Surrender meant certain death for all of them, while prolonged fighting risked drawing unwanted attention from other criminals who might be working with Blackwood. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone," Silas called out, hoping to negotiate rather than continue lethal combat. "Let us pass, and you can ride away with your lives and no legal trouble from the sheriff." The offer was genuine. He wanted Hope safely delivered to the children who needed her, not revenge against men whose greed had made them enemies. Blackwood's answer came in the form of rifle fire that chipped stone inches from Silas's position. "Only one of us walks out of here, old man. That horse is worth more money than you've seen in your whole broken-down life." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone whose criminal enterprise depended on this single success. The standoff stretched toward dawn, each minute bringing them closer to the time when travel would become impossible without detection by other watchers. Hope's safety depended on reaching Denver before Blackwood's network could mobilize additional resources. But the current fight threatened to delay them beyond any hope of successful completion. Silas checked his ammunition with the methodical precision. The combat had drilled into every veteran who'd survived more than one engagement. 6 rounds remaining in his revolver, a dozen more in his cartridge belt, against at least 2 enemies in strong positions with unclear resources. The arithmetic of warfare suggested bold action, rather than defensive patience, time, to remind Ezra Blackwood that some old soldiers never truly learned to retreat. The children's letters lay scattered on the ground beside Hope's cart, their innocent handwriting stark against the violence surrounding them. Doc Henderson had been carrying them as evidence of Hope's intended destination, but a stray bullet had torn through his saddlebag and scattered the precious documents across the rocky canyon floor. Even in the midst of gunfire, the sight of those heartfelt messages struck Silas with renewed understanding of what was truly at stake. "Dear Charity," one letter began in a child's careful script, "the doctors say you're coming to help me feel better. "I can't walk anymore, but maybe you won't mind. I've been saving carrots from my lunch." The simple words carried weight that transformed this fight from personal survival to sacred duty, reminding Silas that every moment of delay meant continued suffering for children who'd already endured more than anyone should. Hope had taken a grazing bullet across her left shoulder. The wound superficial, but enough to draw blood and demonstrate how quickly their mission could turn catastrophic. Doc Henderson worked frantically to clean and bandage the injury, while Silas maintained defensive fire. The old physician's steady hands treating Hope with the same professional care he'd shown human patients throughout his long career. "She's going to be fine," Doc Henderson called out, his voice carrying relief mixed with determination. "Bullet barely broke the skin, but we need to end this soon. She's stressed and bleeding, needs proper rest and medical attention." The urgency in his tone reflected both medical concern and tactical reality, prolonged. Combat would threaten Hope's health regardless of who eventually claimed victory. Blackwood made his desperate move as dawn. Light began filtering into the canyon, exposing positions that darkness had concealed. With his remaining companion providing covering fire, he attempted to reach Hope's position through a flanking maneuver that required crossing open ground under Silas's watchful aim. The move spoke of desperation rather than tactical wisdom, the act of someone whose criminal enterprise had reached the point where failure meant ruin. "End of the line, soldier," Blackwood shouted as he broke from cover, his pistol blazing, while he charged across the exposed ground between his position and the alcove where Hope waited. "That horse is worth $5,000 in California. More money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. His words revealed the true scope of his criminal operation. The sale of stolen therapy animals to wealthy buyers who cared nothing for their intended purpose. Silas met the charge with the cold precision that had made him legendary among his Civil War comrades. His first shot shattered Blackwood's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning into the rocks while the man screamed curses that echoed off canyon walls. The second shot took him in the leg, dropping him to the stone floor where he writhed in pain and impotent fury. The remaining attacker abandoned his position and fled when he saw his leader fall, spurring his horse toward the canyon entrance with the frantic haste of someone whose loyalty extended only as far as his prospects for survival. Silas let him go, more interested in securing Hope and completing their journey than pursuing a demoralized criminal whose testimony might eventually prove useful against Blackwood's larger operation. "It's over," Silas announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd ended similar confrontations many times before. Blackwood lay groaning among the scattered children's letters, his blood mingling with innocent words about carrots and hopes for healing. The contrast between his criminal greed and the children's simple faith made the moral dimensions of their struggle starkly clear. Sheriff Matthews appeared at the canyon entrance with a posse of local ranchers, drawn by the gunfire and guided by the escaped attacker's panicked flight. The lawman surveyed the scene with professional efficiency, taking note of Blackwood's condition, the scattered evidence, and Hope's minor wound, before beginning the process of sorting legal responsibility from criminal activity. "Found this in his saddlebag," Sheriff Matthews announced, producing a leather portfolio filled with forged documents and correspondence revealing the scope of Blackwood's animal theft operation. Bills of sale for horses stolen across 3 states, letters from buyers in California willing to pay premium prices for specialty animals, shipping records that show he's been doing this for years. The evidence painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Hope's theft, involving dozens of animals and thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. Blackwood's operation had targeted therapy animals specifically, knowing their specialized training made them valuable to unscrupulous buyers who asked no questions about provenance or legal ownership. Hope moved carefully to Silas's side as Doc Henderson finished cleaning her wound, the little horse showing remarkable composure despite the violence she'd witnessed and the injury she'd sustained. Her trust remained absolute, her loyalty unshaken by circumstances that might have traumatized less resilient animals. The bond between them had been tested by gunfire and proven stronger than legal claims or criminal threats. "Hospital's expecting us by noon," Doc Henderson observed, checking the sun's position against their remaining travel time. "If we leave now and push hard, we can still make the delivery on schedule." The practical concerns of completing their mission reasserted themselves now that the immediate threat had been eliminated and justice begun. It's slow but inevitable work, but as they prepared to continue their journey to Denver, Silas found himself studying hope with eyes that saw both the companion who'd healed his heart and the therapy animal whose true purpose demanded sacrifice greater than he'd imagined possible. The hardest part of their mission still lay ahead, the moment when love would require letting go. 3 months after delivering hope to St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Silas Granger sat in the Denver jeweler's shop, holding a simple gold band that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the storefront windows. The new wedding ring was different from the elaborate band he'd given Sarah 25 years earlier, plainer, more practical, reflecting the man he'd become rather than the eager young veteran who'd once promised her the moon and stars. Sarah's original ring lay in Hope's halter now, a blessing and benediction that had felt right the moment Silas placed it there, on that terrible, wonderful day when he'd finally let her go. The little horse had accepted the gift with the same grace she'd shown throughout their brief but transformative time together, as if she understood that love shared created more love rather than less. The hospital visit remained vivid in his memory, every detail preserved with the clarity that came from moments that changed everything. Hope had walked into the children's ward like a small miracle, her presence transforming the sterile medical environment into something magical. 23 young faces had lit up with joy that made all of Silas's sacrifice worthwhile, their laughter and gentle touches proving that some gifts were meant to heal more than one broken soul at a time. Little Emma, confined to a wheelchair but radiant with possibility, had been the first child to approach Hope with trembling hands. "She's so soft," the 8-year-old had whispered, her eyes bright with tears of joy rather than the pain that had marked her features for months. "Just like I dreamed she'd be." The moment had nearly broken Silas's heart, even as it mended something fundamental in his understanding of love's true purpose. Dr. Patricia Henley, the hospital's chief of pediatric medicine, had explained Hope's work with professional enthusiasm that barely contained her emotional investment in the therapy program. "She'll visit patients who can't tolerate human contact, provide comfort during procedures that would otherwise be unbearable, teach trust to children who've learned to fear everyone in white coats." Each description had added weight to Silas's certainty that surrendering Hope served purposes greater than his personal healing. The monthly visits had become sacred rituals, journeys from his mountain ranch to the city hospital where Hope continued working miracles that humbled and inspired everyone who witnessed them. Silas would arrive bearing letters from Doc Henderson and Sheriff Matthews, small gifts from the ranch, and stories about the animals he'd begun rescuing in Hope's honor. The children always greeted him like a beloved grandfather, eager to share Hope's latest accomplishments and their own progress toward healing. Hope's transformation from frightened foundling to confident therapy animal amazed even the hospital staff who'd worked with such programs for years. She moved through the wards with intuitive understanding of each child's needs, offering gentle comfort to the dying and playful encouragement to those fighting toward recovery. Her presence had become so essential that hospital administrators were already planning expansion of the therapy program to include other specially trained animals. Martha Caldwell had been the general store's widow for 2 years when Silas finally worked up courage to ask her for Sunday dinner. Their courtship proceeded with the careful deliberation of people who'd learned that love was too precious to rush, but too valuable to postpone indefinitely. She possessed the same gentle strength that had drawn him to Sarah, but her affection carried different qualities shaped by her own experiences with loss and renewal. Their wedding took place on Silas's ranch, with Hope attending as honored guest, her presence blessing a union that felt like natural completion rather than replacement of what had been lost. Martha brought her own gifts to their partnership, business knowledge from running the store, social connections that drew Silas back into community life, and understanding that shared grief could become shared joy with proper tending. The ranch itself had been transformed into something Sarah would have approved, a sanctuary for animals that needed healing as much as Silas once had. Rescued horses grazed alongside cattle in pastures that rang with life rather than echoing with emptiness. Dogs that had been abandoned found new purpose as working companions, while cats claimed territories around barns that buzzed with productive activity. Sheriff Matthews brought regular news of Blackwood's legal troubles, the criminals' extensive operation unraveling as evidence mounted and victims came forward to testify. The man would spend years in territorial prison. His fraudulent documents and stolen animals returned to their rightful owners, while his network of buyers faced their own legal consequences. Justice moved slowly but inexorably, serving notice that some crimes carried prices that extended far beyond immediate punishment. Each evening, Silas would sit on his porch with Martha beside him and read Hope's latest letter from the hospital staff, who'd learned to keep him informed of her ongoing work. The little horse had helped 14 children take their first steps after major surgery, provided comfort to 6 families facing terminal diagnoses, and taught trust to countless patients who'd forgotten how to accept kindness from strangers. "She's healing them the same way she healed you," Martha observed during one such evening, her hand finding his as they watched sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Shows that love shared doesn't get smaller. It multiplies until everyone touched by it carries some of that blessing forward." The observation captured truth that had taken Silas months to fully understand. Hope's gift hadn't been taken from him when he delivered her to Denver. It had been planted like seed corn that would grow into harvests he was only beginning to appreciate. The children she touched would carry forward whatever healing she provided, spreading her influence in ways that made their brief time together part of something infinitely larger. Standing at Sarah's grave during his weekly visits, Silas no longer spoke to the past, but planned for futures that honored memory through action rather than mourning. The wooden cross remained unchanged, but his understanding of what it represented had expanded to include all the love that death couldn't diminish and sacrifice couldn't destroy. Hope lived in Denver now, serving purposes that justified every moment of pain her absence had cost him. But the healing she'd begun continued in the ranch that bore witness to love's ability to multiply through sharing, in the marriage that proved hearts could expand rather than simply transfer affection, and in the knowledge that some gifts were meant to be given away in order to discover their true value.